Vladimir Putin has secured a fifth term as Russia's president, extending his leadership until 2030, making him the longest-serving ruler since Catherine the Great, surpassing Joseph Stalin. In the recent election, Putin won with 87% of the vote, surpassing his previous record of 76.7%. However, these elections lacked credible opposition due to the Kremlin's tight control over the political system, media, and electoral process. Several Western leaders have criticized the process, calling it unfair and undemocratic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described him as a dictator, thirsty for power, while the White House highlighted the lack of freedom and justice in the elections, pointing out Putin's repression of political opponents. On the other hand, China congratulated Putin on his victory and expressed its confidence in the strengthening of relations between both countries under the strategic leadership of Presidents Xi Jinping and Putin. The keys to the victory of the Russian president include several significant factors. The war in Ukraine and economic recovery. The war in Ukraine has isolated Russia from Western countries and forced the country to reorganize its economy. This context has allowed Putin to reinforce his propaganda machinery and tighten the siege on opponents. Although opposition to the war has been silenced, with the absence of candidates at the polls and a limitation on publicly expressing anti-war sentiment, Putin has been able to use the conflict to his advantage, according to Ekaterina Shulman, a Russian political scientist based in Berlin. When it started, it was going to be like the Crimea model, only bigger, he says, but it was obviously neither brief nor bloodless, and it affected the way Russians see themselves, the outside world and their leader. After the first months of the war, in which many Russians lived a kind of honeymoon around the flag, when a massive mobilization occurred in September 2022, anxiety skyrocketed, people were extremely scared and the support for the war decreased, says the political scientist. It was then that Putin changed the narrative around the war. It is no longer a war with Ukraine, but a war with the West, and this makes many Russians feel proud because the army is not only attacking a small country, but who is fighting against a much bigger opponent. Andrei Soldatov, a Russian journalist who has lived in exile in London since he was forced to flee in 2020, explains to the BBC. This confrontation has become a recurring feature in the Russian president's speeches, where he frequently issues threats and warnings to both the West and NATO member countries about the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. The narrative promoted by the Kremlin, which portrays NATO as a threat to Russia that is approaching its borders, has resonated with the population, according to Soldatov. Furthermore, according to the Russian journalist, the West has not devoted enough effort to explaining to the world the importance of the conflict in Ukraine. People in Africa or South America, for example, don't understand why they should care, and this is a gap that Putin has exploited, he says. However, the war has had an unexpected consequence that has favored the Russian president. Despite the unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, the country has surprised many economists by becoming the fastest-growing economy in Europe. The economy is doing well, given the circumstances, and it has made Putin popular because he presents himself once again as someone who has challenged the West in its great assault on the Russian economy, explains the BBC's economic correspondent in Russia, Alexei Kalmykov. Despite expectations of contracting, the Russian economy has experienced growth of 2.6%, according to estimates by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, despite Western sanctions that have involved the freezing of assets worth $300,000 millions. One key is that these sanctions have not been universal, allowing Russia to maintain free trade with countries such as China, India, and Brazil. In addition, its neighbors, including Kazakhstan and Armenia, have collaborated to circumvent Western sanctions. Russia is a huge economy, Kalmykov says, adding, it will take decades of extensive sanctions and mismanagement to bring it to its knees, and neither is happening right now. Russia makes money by exporting commodities and is basically free to sell whatever it wants, Kalmykov explains. Oil sanctions are decorative, and Russia's main buyer, the EU, does not sanction natural gas, grain and nuclear fuels at all. Shulman explains that although the products cost 4 times more than before, they are easily available, which she says is more important. Russians are used to rising prices. Our main national fear is not inflation, but deficit. The lack of products on the shelves, that last Soviet horror. Kalmykov agrees, it's all a matter of perspective, and that's something Putin's propaganda machine knows how to handle very well. 2. Disqualified opponents, in exile or dead. Putin knows how to suppress all kinds of political debate in the country, explains Soldatov. And because he's so good at it, he's also very good at eliminating his political opponents, he adds. Only 3 additional candidates managed to participate in the 2024 elections, but none posed a significant challenge to Putin. All expressed explicit support for both the president and Russia's stance in the Ukraine war. Real political threats to Putin have been silenced through imprisonment, assassination or impeachment, although the Kremlin denies any involvement in these events. Just a month before the polls opened, Putin's most prominent opponent, Alexei Navalny, 47, died in a penal colony located at the northern edge of the Arctic Circle. Navalny was serving a long sentence on charges of fraud, contempt of court and extremism, although human rights organizations argue these charges were politically motivated. Putin despises his opposition, Soldatov says. His response when someone of political importance is killed is to say that he is insignificant, and he refers to his own widespread support to say, why would he kill him? The Kremlin is very good at making these excuses. Several of Putin's rivals have been murdered, from politicians to journalists. Last year, the leader of the private Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, died in a plane crash just months after an attempted mutiny. In 2015, Boris Nemtsov, a politician and opinionated critic, was shot dead on a bridge near the Kremlin, and in 2006, a journalist highly critical of the war in Chechnya, Anna Politkovskaya, was found shot to death in Moscow. It is very scary to live in a country where journalists, politicians and activists are murdered and imprisoned, says Soldatov. Psychologically it's very uncomfortable, so ordinary people are willing to buy the Kremlin narrative not because we believe it, but because we want to find a way to live with it. Putin has also sought to control individual dissent within the general public. Since 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin has introduced new censorship laws that repress anti-government stances, with new crimes such as discrediting the Russian military punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The president assured that the protests that took place during these elections had no effect, and that any crime would be punished after the vote. According to Soldatov, Putin's fears focus not so much on what the international media can report, but on what ordinary citizens can witness on the streets, share on social media and spread to millions of people. Given this vulnerability, Putin considers it necessary to repress any form of dissent, since he believes that the next revolution could start with just 2 or 3 people protesting in the street, according to the journalist. 3. Concentration of power in the figure of Putin. Despite international criticism calling the election a farce, the wide margin by which Putin won in Russia allows the Kremlin to argue internally that the entire nation has rallied around Vladimir Putin and that the president has the full support of his people, analyzes Steve Rosenberg, BBC Russia editor. This 87% of the vote not only gives Putin a popular mandate for his policy in Ukraine and for the direction of the country, but also sends a clear message to the Russian political elite. Take note, there is still only one man here in charge, in control, and that is not going to change in the short term. Although it may be the result of propaganda, Putin has strong popular support among many Russians, who believe that the image of him as a strong leader is what the country needs, especially in times of conflict. During the more than 2 decades that he has been in power, Putin has avoided the emergence of competitors who could threaten his position, and his presence is omnipresent in the country. However, the elections have also shown certain signs of weakness. Although he was ultimately not allowed to run as a candidate, anti-war opponent Boris Nadezhdin managed to gather more than 100,000 signatures, according to him, for his candidacy. This anti-war sentiment could make new recruitment difficult, according to Kimberly Martin, an expert on Russia and international security at Barnard College at Columbia University, cited by BBC Mundo. The war economy, with a huge increase in military spending, is also difficult to sustain in the long term, analysts warn. In addition, thousands of people lined up at noon at the polling stations as a form of protest, as Alexei Navalny's widow had requested and despite strict police surveillance. The crowds that came out to commemorate the opponent after his death in the Arctic prison also showed that there is a mass of citizens willing to protest despite the repression. But Putin, thanks to the constitutional reform that was approved in 2020 after a referendum, could serve at least 2 more 6-year terms and be president until 2036, when he would be 83 years old. But now it's your turn to tell us, what did you think of these conclusions to determine Putin's success in Russia? Do you agree? If you found the video useful, we would appreciate it if you gave it a like to support our project and if you subscribe. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.